You're listening to TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour, with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
I know that at different times during the last year, talking to different guests, I'd made reference to Scott Lively. Scott is a subscriber to Dixie Heritage. He was also a gubernatorial candidate in the state of Massachusetts, who nearly won the Republican nomination for governor, despite the fact that he was seeking it against the incumbent Charlie Baker, who the news media for the last 2 years has been dubbing to be the most popular governor in America. And yet all Scott had to do was show up at the convention and announce his challenge of Governor Baker, and delegates literally were flocking to him. It was just amazing. But anyways, we have been talking about him throughout the course of the last year at different times, and I said I was going to have him on the show. Of course, in addition to his political activism, he is also the author of a very controversial book titled The Pink Swastika. And so in some cases we were referring to having him on the show to discuss politics, and in other times I was saying I was going to have him on the show to discuss the pink swastika. I had talked to Dr. Lively actually at the beginning of this year, and he had agreed to do both. But because of the gubernatorial campaign and other things that were happening, we could never get our schedules together to put a show together. And then when the election was over, I had reached out to him to get some post-election commentary. Schedules did not intersect. We couldn't get them together. But about 2 weeks after the election, there at the end of the month of November, we were able to get our stuff together. We were able to, things had calmed down enough for him especially, but also for me. And we were able to get some time together on the phone. And we were able to record an interview. And what an interview it is. He starts talking about how when he was a young man, he was a drunk and a drug addict, and how Jesus saved him. And becoming involved in the church, he became involved in the abortion protests, and then involved in the abortion protests, and the anti-abortion or the pro-life activism enabled him to see the broader political spectrum, which was how he ended up writing a book with a title like The Pink Swastika. And then he ran for governor in 2014, and then he ran again and nearly won in 2018. And it was a journey. And he describes the journey, and he describes how a political campaign is forged and how it is built and how it is operated. And he also explains in the course of this conversation how politics works in Massachusetts, because politics doesn't work in Massachusetts the way it works in the other 49 states, which is why people like Elizabeth Warren, for example, could be a senator from Massachusetts despite all of the things that she's done and all of the lies she has been caught in. It's why Teddy Kennedy could have been a senator from Massachusetts for a lifetime, despite, and even get away with murder in that state, or at least vehicular manslaughter. I'm going to back that up a second, and I don't think that murder would require malice, forethought, intent, and I don't believe that Teddy Kennedy hopped in his car that night with the intention of killing Mary Jo Kopechne. But it doesn't change the fact that he was drunk. He was in a car with a woman other than his wife. He drove that car off a bridge. She died. And he didn't even bother to report the accident until 10 hours into the next day after he'd slept off his drunk. But how could a man like that spend a lifetime in Massachusetts politics and be as successful as he was? Well, again, politics in Massachusetts just don't work like they do in the rest of the country. And he explains how that Massachusetts political system is organized and how it works, and how he attempted to take a stab at it, and how hopefully he's changed it at least a little bit for the good, moving the football of conservatism and Americanism and constitutionalism just a few yards forward in that fight. And so it's a great interview. You'll want to stay tuned for the remainder of the hour so that you can listen to it. This was, so you'll know, one of the interviews that we recorded by telephone after we started having our software failures. We talked about that last week, how after the Mac OS update, how the software that we were using to record phone calls stopped working. And so this phone call had the same problems as our interview with Russell Walker did. The only difference is with this one, we were able to figure out a little bit how to use sound filters, programs like, I can't remember the name of the program now. Audacity, that's the name of the program, Audacity. We were able to use sound filters in Audacity to amplify the sound and to kind of make it sound a little bit louder and a little bit better than we were able to do with Russell. But again, the same truth applies. If you enjoy listening to these interviews here on the Dixie Heritage Hour, consider either sending us a small donation, or at the very least, just take out an advertisement here on the program. And the money from your advertisement will give us the money that we need to upgrade our software so that we can do this on a great professional level and we can have some great sounding interviews coming into 2019. Anyways, more about 2019 at the end of the program. Here today is Dr. Scott Lively, gubernatorial candidate from Massachusetts and author of the book, The Pink Swastika. Actually, Dr. Lively, let's start with your testimony, your Christian testimony. Let's start there and move forward from there.
I was, for many years, an alcoholic and a drug addict, 16 years from the age of 12. My father had been very severely mentally ill. In response to that, I retreated into alcoholism at 12. Spent 16 years in bondage to alcohol and then drugs. And in 1986, February 1st, I surrendered my life to Jesus Christ, healed and delivered, never had another desire to take drugs or drink ever again. Praise God, I've been living a successful Christian life ever since.
Where then did your call to the ministry come from? I mean, how did that kind of transpire?
Well, in those days, the only job that I could really hold was as a handyman. And so that was my background, and I did sort of odd jobs, and I had built it up to be, a functioning business. And when I got healed and delivered, I continued on and developed further into contracting, but I began listening to Christian radio, Dr. Dobson, and in those days D. James Kennedy, and others, and very motivated by what I was hearing. That was at the height of the rescue movement, also pro-life rescue movement, and I was attending a church that had a very strong pro-life pastor. And one day I got hold of the pro-life magazine called Life Advocate, which is really the magazine of the rescue movement. I saw pictures of aborted babies for the first time. And it was so shocking and appalling to me that I literally, over the next couple of months, I shut down my business. I went full-time trying to stop the killing of the unborn. And I didn't join any group. I just went out to the clinics myself. I talked to women going in. I held signs. I organized people to come out and join me. And then over time, I got to be known as an activist. And I joined the Oregon Citizens Alliance. And this is all happening in Portland, Oregon. And in a short period of time, I became the state communications director. This divine coordination. They were doing a ballot measure opposing abortion in that election cycle. And then that was the 1990 election cycle. And then in the next election cycle, they switched focus to the LGBT agenda, the No Special Rights Act. And we were really the pioneers of that. Our version failed in Oregon, but a sister organization in Colorado passed what became known as Amendment 2, which was the basis for the notorious Supreme Court ruling in Romer versus Evans, that the first of five written by, or actually four written by Supreme Court Justice not Scalia, Scalia's a good guy, written by Anthony Kennedy, really, those rulings established gay supremacy here in the U.S. So that's my background, and from the time that I started dealing with the LGBT agenda and began receiving the incredible abuse and harassment that comes to anybody who takes that on, I realized that was the battle that needed leadership more than the pro-life movement, because there were a lot of people willing to fight abortion, but almost no one was willing to stand up against the LGBT movement because they exact such a price for opposing them. So that's really sort of my ministry history in a nutshell.
Well, I saw a statistic not too long ago. Pollsters were asking two questions. It was a nationwide poll, and they were asking two questions. And the first question was, what percentage of the American population is, gay, lesbian, transgendered, etc.? And, the answers were all over the map. And then, and then the next question would be, what percentage of the population do you think is, whatever? And the answers to those questions averaged out to about 25%.
Yeah.
So that, the typical American thinks that 25% of the nation are sodomites. Of course, then the respondent would be told that the actual number was like 3.2%.
Yeah, that's right. The most authoritative study that's been done in the past couple of decades was University of Chicago, and it was between 2 and 3%, different for men and women. I don't remember the exact final numbers, but it's understandable that people would think it's 25% of the population because they're so overrepresented in entertainment media and in the news. One would think that there are enormous numbers to have that kind of coverage and favorable status, but no, it's not true. When it comes in terms of having political power, the left always makes such a big deal about the NRA, the ultimate power broker in the country, but the NRA is nothing compared to the LGBT lobby. I mean, they are just enormously powerful, and they manage to bend all the politicians to their will. Whenever their agenda is threatened in any way, or they have a particularly important piece to their agenda that they want to push through, all of a sudden, it doesn't matter where it is, even anywhere in the world, all of a sudden the rules just don't apply anymore. They fast-track an emergency measure, and it just seems to happen everywhere. And it's because it's a spiritual battle. And, this is end time stuff. And this is, gay theology and this agenda. This is the representation of the rebellion, the satanic rebellion against God. It's best expressed through extreme sexual perversion, as it always has been since the Canaanites established their demonic religion based on sexual perversion and human sacrifice back, in the days of Noah.
So did you graduate from law school before all of the drunkenness and all that before your conversion, or did you go to and graduate from law school after you started fighting this LGBTQ and however many other letters they're putting into it now battle?
No, it was much later. Really, I had no educational background to speak of at the time that I got involved in Christian activism. I barely graduated high school because I'd spent all of my teen years as an addict and an alcoholic. In fact, it was a hippie alternative free school that I graduated from, believe it or not. I was as far to the left then as I am to the right now. But when I got saved and healed, I had maybe 25 or 30 college credits from miscellaneous classes I'd taken just for personal interest. No, when I got into this battle with the Oregon Citizens Alliance, and they hit us with everything: death threats, bomb threats, vandalism, hate crimes, mail tampering, everything you can think of to try to shut us down. And the Lord has made me an articulate spokesman for the biblical worldview, and so they're particularly heinous and malicious in their pursuit of me. But the worst were the lawsuits. I've had five major lawsuits over the course of my career. The first four of them all happened between 1992 and 1994. But during that time, I knew that I either had to leave the field of battle and give up and go away, be silenced, or I had to get better skills to fight the battles and to be able to defend myself. So I decided to go to law school and then I needed, in order to do that, I had to get associate's degree and a bachelor's degree, and then pass the LSAT, and then get into a law school. And so I began pursuing that at that point. So I didn't have any educational background whatsoever, and so got my law degree, and then got a PhD from the Pentecostal Assemblies of God, and I got credentials in international human rights from the Institute of Human Rights in Strasbourg, France, in the midst of all that. And so I've actually have better credentials on these things than almost everybody that's on the other side that I ever do battle with. Editing is great when it's not being done by somebody with a leftist political agenda.
Right. I know this was not your first gubernatorial campaign, but did the gubernatorial campaigns, then were they the natural outgrowth of the other political activism, or how did you end up running for governor? I mean, it's one thing to hold a picket sign at a gay pride parade or at an abortion clinic. It's another thing to run for governor, and it's yet another thing to run for governor and do it as successfully as you did. In other words, you weren't just the typical, far-right wannabe who filed a few papers and ran a quote-unquote gubernatorial campaign and a few people wrote in votes for him. I mean, you worked the conventions, you got the delegates, you got yourself on the ballot. I mean, you spent a lot of money, you put in the time. I mean, you did it right.
Well, yeah, I ran twice, though. The first time, and I'll explain, like I said, I was sued 5 times, major lawsuits. The 5th lawsuit was filed against me in 2012. And it was filed, this was the worst of all. Remember, these guys, when you stand up to them, they don't ever give up. They don't go away. They don't leave you alone. They just simply ratchet up the opposition until you finally capitulate. It's like they did with the Boy Scouts of America. The Boy Scouts of America won a Supreme Court case acknowledging their constitutional right to discriminate against homosexuals as scout leaders, right? That's the court of final appeal. Did the gays stop pursuing them, harassing them? No, they just doubled down. And eventually, the Boy Scouts capitulated because these guys are relentless. They never, ever give up. And that's what they have done for 30 years with me. I'm just stubborn, and I'm standing on a biblical platform. I believe in the sovereignty of God, and I believe in speaking the truth even if they cut my head off. And so when we reached the level in Massachusetts, I had gone in 2008 with my wife, and we started an inner city mission in Springfield, Massachusetts. I wasn't really dealing with the homosexual issue at that time. I was doing, benevolence and, evangelism and good works on the theme of trying to re-Christianize post-Christian cities. But the fact that I was Scott Lively, and I had moved into the most homosexual state in the Union, Massachusetts, they determined that they were going to drive me out. And so what they did is I had gone in 2009 to Uganda and did a conference there, and following that, without my contribution and foreknowledge, they came out with a pretty harsh law against the anti-homosexuality law, and they took this as an opportunity to try to take me down. They accused me of being the mastermind of what they started calling the Kill the Gays bill, and then casting me as a social pariah and someone equivalent to Hitler, wanted to exterminate homosexuals. All false, complete lie. I opposed that particular bill from the beginning, but they don't care about any of this stuff. And in the midst of this, a leader of a group called Sexual Minorities Uganda, SMUG, SMUG is their acronym, of all things, was murdered in early 2011. And they had already been harassing me ahead of time on this theme, but then this guy gets murdered, and they immediately jump on this and say, this is a homophobic hate crime, Lively's responsible. And David Cato's blood is on his hands. And of course, a few days later, they actually catch the guy, the murderer. Turns out to be a gay prostitute that Cato had bailed out of jail to be his live-in lover and houseboy. And of course, the media at that point completely stopped covering the story. And so nobody heard that fact except those of us who were in the know. But anyway, I was vindicated among those who actually knew the story. But a year later, I get this lawsuit filed against me in U.S. federal court in Springfield, Massachusetts, with a far left federal judge, and this is a lawsuit being brought by the so-called Center for Constitutional Rights, a Marxist law firm based literally 666 Broadway in Manhattan, and they bring this lawsuit for crimes against humanity against me for preaching against homosexuality in Uganda, building this whole case around the idea that my speech there had generated, this violent hatred against homosexuals that resulted in the death of David Kato, even though the guy that did it is serving prison, 30 years jail sentence in Uganda at the time. That left all that stuff out of the case, but because this judge was on their side, he didn't even care, even when we brought it up later. Anyway, so I suffered being under that. Now, that's all background to why I ran for office the first time, because the reason I did it is because I knew these guys were setting me up. This was going to be a Massachusetts jury pool that I was going to have to face, and they were poisoning my name every day in the paper. They were making sure that every person who was going to be on that jury pool was going to think of Scott Lively as a Hitler that has to be stopped. And they put me in what I call the Saul Alinsky box. Saul Alinsky taught his Marxist followers, that you pick a target to be the symbol of your opposition. You freeze the target in place by controlling all the information that the public hears about that person, and then you destroy that person publicly as an example of what happens to those to their enemies. And that's what they had done to me. And I knew the only way to break out of the Saul Alinsky box was to do something beyond their ability to control in terms of the information. And that's why in 2014 I ran for governor the first time. Now, I also wanted an opportunity to preach the gospel into the political arena, especially in Massachusetts where it's so completely dark. And so that's what I did. And it worked. And I broke the Saul Alinsky box. I got lots of coverage. I was in the debates, but I didn't want to win. I told people I didn't want to win. And it was just what I got from it was the opportunity to preach the gospel and to break their strategy of killing me in this lawsuit. So anyway, that's why I ran the first time. And I'll pause now, so I've been talking straight through for a monologue.
If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
But obviously you were running to win the second time. The second time around this 2018 election cycle, you were playing for keeps. I mean, it was obvious. You would not have put forth the effort and the energy that you did had you not been going for it.
That's right. And whereas the first time it was solely to have a platform, this time I ran to win. And, running to win and expecting to win are two different things. But they still require the mentality of doing it as if you can win. And I think there was a possibility that I could have won. But Charlie Baker is the most popular governor in America, according to the leftist polls, and enormous amount of money. So it was, it was unlikely that I was going to win, but I ran as if I would win.
Well, if he was really the most popular governor, if Charlie was really the most popular governor in America, how did you get over 1/3 of the delegates at his own convention?
That's right. Well, because he's popular with the Democrats, and it's a heavily Democrat state. It's 2-to-1 enrollments in the Democrat Party over Republican. So, and he knows that. He was a golden boy for William Weld years ago. He was the governor that came in and basically started the slide to the left in the Massachusetts GOP, and it never stopped going to the left. Went through Weld, Romney, and then Baker being the most liberal of the three, and with an enormous amount of government experience and how to maneuver, how to manipulate things. And he got complete control of the GOP. They thought they were going to keep me under 5% at the convention. I ended up getting 27.6%, something like that. It was a very, very sizable delegate count in there. Blew them away. They never thought that was possible. And then I continued on, and in the primary election, I got 36.1% against a completely stacked deck. And I spent $140,000 total. He had to spend over $7 million between himself and a couple of super PACs in order to keep that seat. But anyway, he never would have had to do that if he didn't know that he was really at risk. And meanwhile, and the media was completely supporting him. They suppressed. They either viciously attacked me, which they were good at, the Boston Globe and the Springfield Republican being the two dominant media forces there. And they both passionately hated me, and it was non-stop propaganda. But the rest of the media just suppressed my name, so that the voters didn't know there was an alternative to Charlie Baker. So, but anyway, we did very well, and it was impressive. We advanced the conservative movement further in Massachusetts in 2018 in my campaign than the conservatives have been able to get in a half century.
Well, explain this in dollars and cents terms. How much money as far as dollars spent per vote received, what did you spend? What did each vote cost you?
Well, I think it comes down somewhere around $1.35 or something like that for me, and it cost him about $40 a vote. I mean, it was outrageously disparate. Literally, he spent over $7 million to get 175,000 votes. I spent a little less than $140,000 to get 100,000 votes. So he got 70. It cost him like $6.8 million to get that extra 75,000 votes that beat me.
And what would have happened had you won the governorship of Massachusetts? Had the miraculous happened.
Well, if I had won the primary, that would have been really the biggest political earthquake since the Trump election. Maybe even bigger, because it was Scott Lively and it was Massachusetts, and it was the most popular governor in America. But so they had no choice but to spend everything that they could to make sure that didn't happen. And frankly, I probably would have, or I possibly could have taken the nomination at the convention if it hadn't been for two things. The one, Charlie Baker went into the convention with hundreds of superdelegates, just like Hillary versus Bernie. Delegates, I didn't have any superdelegates. And then on top of that, it was an open ballot. It wasn't a secret ballot. And enormous number of people in that convention hall were, economically dependent on Charlie Baker because he uses patronage like a mafia don to buy loyalty. And then he had his goons going on the floor, basically twisting everybody's arm and making sure that everybody knew that this was a vote that was being monitored. They literally had a back room with his people monitoring the vote, how the vote was going, in real time on camera, and everybody knew that. So the fact that I got 27.6% of the vote was mind blowing in that context. And if it hadn't been for those, the thumb on the scale that Baker had, I possibly could have won at that point. And that would, of course, have changed everything from the date of the convention. We wouldn't have to wait for the primary for it to have that kind of earthquake effect.
So had you got enough delegates at the convention, you're saying there never would have been a primary?
Well, there would still have been a primary, but the effect of having somebody beat Charlie Baker at the convention would have been, there would have been an earthquake like they've never seen before. It would have been national, maybe even international news, because it just doesn't happen that way, especially against the guy that's really, Charlie Baker is the left's golden boy. I think he's tied in with Clinton and all those guys. I think that his strategy has always been to run against Trump in 2020, either maybe starting out on his own and then folding in under Romney. I think Romney's pretty certain to be running also. But the whole thing, everything that was going on in Massachusetts, all about Trump. Everything that the left is doing. Maura Healey, the lesbian attorney general of Massachusetts, her entire division is focused on taking down Trump. They filed like 40 different lawsuits. That's all they do in the attorney general's office is go against Trump. And of course, that's where Robert Mueller comes from, right? That's his roots, and it's been, there was Obama's great buddy Deval Patrick, the black governor just before Romney came in. That Baker came in, and interestingly, Deval Patrick, as soon as he leaves office, goes into Bain Capital, on the board of Bain Capital, which is Romney's, power base. But anyways, I call it the uniparty, the purple uniparty. It's the elites in both parties. They are united together against the populist conservatives and have been for a very, very long time.
Well, I know that you've had quite a bit of, call it political altercation, call it battle, call it frustration with Charlie Baker during this past election cycle and even previous to that. But before that, did you and Mitt Romney have that kind of a relationship, or were you not politically involved enough at that time to?
No, I wasn't. I've always been somewhat political, but I never have been involved in candidate politics ever until 2014. And I left. I was born and raised in Shelburne Falls, Massachusetts. So I lived in Massachusetts from the time I was born till I was 19, and then I left, and I was gone for 30 years. I didn't go back to Massachusetts. I visited my mom a couple times, but I didn't go back to Massachusetts to live or be involved in any way until January of 2008, and so I missed most of the decline. And I got there when I got there in 2008. The damage to the state had largely been done in terms of the collapse of Republican principles, and the conservatives were trying to dig out, get control again. But it's really like civil war there in the rank and file of the Republican Party between the rhinos and the real conservatives. And so 2014, I got involved, but I didn't have much of an impact in terms of the advancement of the conservative cause, because really I was pursuing my own agenda of preaching the gospel and defeating the lawsuit. But 2018 was a different story, and we really did advance the conservative cause considerably during that time. And no conservatives got 100,000 votes in a very long time.
I'm going to ask just one more thing about Mitt Romney, then we'll move back to where we're at now politically in Massachusetts. But I know Romney had been the governor of Massachusetts, but I know he didn't grow up there. At the very least, I know his dad had been the governor of, I believe it was Michigan, so he spent at least some of his childhood there. Right now, he is a senator in, or he was a senatorial candidate. I did not check to see if he won his Senate race or not there in Utah. I'm assuming he did.
Yeah, I think he probably did. I would be very, very surprised if he didn't.
After he lost his presidential bid, I know he moved somewhere up in New England, Connecticut, Rhode Island, somewhere up there. All those states forgive me, I'm a Southerner, all of who grew up in
Yeah,
Chicago,
I'm not sure
so all
where
of
he
those
went
states
either, but
blend.
I know, but he's back in Utah now as
Yeah.
a Utah senator, assuming that he won. And like I said,
Yeah.
I think we both pretty certain that that's what happened.
But my question is I guess one is Mitt Romney even from anywhere, or could he just conveniently be from wherever he needs to be to run for office? And really, that's kind of the lead into the big question is, was Mitt Romney ever a political institution in Massachusetts, or was that just one of many places he's blown through in his political career?
Well, I mean, he was the governor there, and he moved the leftist ball forward quite a bit.
Okay.
He was the guy that essentially responsible for gay marriage. He capitulated to them, but he didn't have to. He could have invoked separation of powers and simply opposed the judge who attempted to declare gay marriage valid by judicial fiat, but he didn't do that. And according to the activists who were here in the earlier time, he's the one responsible for basically $50 abortions in Massachusetts. So, when it comes to the sexual revolution issues, which is the heart of the Marxist agenda, break down the family so that you can break down the society and make it easier to bring under, globalist control. He's been, working right along with them, right? And I assume he'll continue to. In Utah, he might have a little more difficulty getting away with it with the constituency out there, but he is, the few people in the Mormon Church are going to have greater influence than in Utah than Mitt Romney. So maybe he can get away with more than I think, even there.
Well, you would think that Romney's liberalism wouldn't sell well in Utah, and that he wouldn't be the only Republican Mormon running for office in that state, but... No, I think he pretty much write his own ticket, I think, when in the Mormon Church, just because of the power that he has. But right.
Anyway, I believe that he's going to run against Trump in 2020, and that Charlie Baker is going to be part of that in some way, and that's what this has all been about. That's the whole 2018 election cycle was ramping up for 2020. And one of the reasons I did so very well is I was outspokenly pro-Trump. My signs that said pro-life, pro-gun, pro-Trump. The pro-life vote, the Second Amendment people, and the Trump people. That was what I was pursuing. And frankly, if I had another $100,000 and I could have gotten my name out around the rest of the state, I would have been up into the mid-40s at least. In the primary election, I might have even taken it.
Well, I've not looked at the map to see where your votes were cast, but assuming that Massachusetts is like New York, where you've got that red dot right there in the city, and then you've got the blue dot right there in the city, and then the rest of the state is red, or Illinois, where you got the blue dot in Chicago, and the rest of the state is red.
Massachusetts is pretty blue. But the reason that Massachusetts voters will vote conservative if they have someone genuinely conservative to vote for. A lot of them are just simply, if there's a choice between a rhino or someone wishy-washy and a Democrat, then it's like if they're going to vote, then they're just going to, why bother? Why bother even voting if there's not enough difference between the candidates? So the Republican Party is down to 10.5% of the enrolled voters. Most people are independents, and a huge number of people just don't even vote because they're so disgusted with liberal policies. But when someone comes forward who is conservative, Ronald Reagan in the 80s, he won both presidential elections in Massachusetts as an outspoken pro-lifer. Right? He wasn't hiding from the social issues. And of course, at that time, the party had decided its strategy was going to be to move left, and that's what they did. They ignored the Reagan message and the example. And then Scott Brown, in his first, when he was elected the first time, well, he lost his re-election because he had run as a conservative. He was against gay marriage in Massachusetts, and he won, by a pretty good margin. And it was only because he flipped on that issue and went left, especially on that issue, that the voters kicked him out next time. But so that's the pattern in Massachusetts. So when there's an authentically conservative person against a liberal, and they aren't some favorite of the Dems, then the conservative can win, and that would have been possible for me. But of course, my race was the primary, and the reason I didn't break 36.1% past that is because of name recognition. 70% of the people that were surveyed had never heard my name, so that was really what was going on. And the party. This is the other thing about my race. The Mass GOP actually cheated at the very beginning. When I entered the race, the party was under the obligation of a neutrality clause within the bylaws, which they violated. They got caught by the Boston Globe, and then I issued a cease and desist letter, and they went ahead and then took a vote of the executive committee to ratify the breach of the contract, and to press forward and openly endorse Baker, and to shun me and deny any assistance to my campaign. I mean, it's unbelievable. I've never seen it happen in the U.S. Before, but that's actually what they did. I have a lawsuit pending against them we're waiting to get some sort of a ruling right now on that. But then during the primary campaign, the party pretended that I didn't exist, and they were putting out their polls. Poll question being, if the gubernatorial election were held today, who would you vote for? Charlie Baker, Jay Gonzalez, Bob Massey, those are the two Democrats, or none of the above, right? Completely just left me off. And the media that was in bed with them, tons of the media is in bed with Charlie Baker, they went right along with it, never mentioned my name. So a huge number of people in the state didn't know that until they saw the ballot. By then, most people go in there with their mind already made up. So, like I said, if I'd had another $100,000, I could have been in enough media for people to at least know that there was an alternative that was pro-life, pro-Second Amendment, and pro-Trump.
Well, I remember at one time you had sent out an email, and you had said that you would have withdrawn that lawsuit had Charlie Baker just agreed to a televised debate. So I'm guessing that never happened.
Never happened. He never agreed to debate. Never mentioned my name. Which on the one hand was actually not that bad. I mean, he had surrogates doing the nastiest, character assassination against me, the Boston Globe and some of the other media that had already on record as hating me. But the party and he himself, they just suppressed information about me, and they knew that was probably going to work. But then, in the leading up to the primary, they must have had some pretty bad poll results, because that's when they pumped in $7 million, which they had originally intended just to wait and save for the general, but they had to spend it in the primary because I think that they saw there was a real potential that I could win.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net
Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
But anyway, it's here it is in middle of November. Moved on into the next election cycle, focused on 2020. And I'm going to use the political capital that I earned in this 2018 election cycle to try to advance the conservative cause further in 2020, help deliver Massachusetts for Trump, and take the party back away from the rhinos.
You had said that in one of the emails, just about every day leading up to the Massachusetts primary for several months, you were sending out almost daily emails, and in several of them you had implied that it was your belief that in 2020 there was going to be, I wasn't for sure if you were implying that Elizabeth Warren and Charlie Baker would be on the same ticket, or if they would be on separate tickets, but that basically, Baker's role in that would be to basically help siphon votes away from Trump, and then would end up with a job in the Warren administration should she wind up being elected. But basically, you implied that there was some political collusion between those two. Do you still think that's in play, or?
Yes, I do. I think the most likely scenario going forward is that both Warren and Baker announced for president in 2020. But Baker on the Republican side, and the whole idea is that he's going to be the voice of Republican reason, right, against Trump, the fifth columnist inside the party. He's far too liberal for the national GOP to accept, and I think everybody knows that. But of course, this would be the strategy: is he basically just gets out there, gets national name recognition, then folds in under Romney, or basically sits out the rest of it, or continues to be a commentator on the race, because the media is going to love him whether or not he's a contender or not. And then if Warren wins, which I think was their intention, that's their belief, then he would enter her administration as Secretary of Health and Human Services, and be an example of bipartisan unity after 4 years of Trump hell. That would be their narrative. But it could be the same thing. It could be Clinton. Warren may just be a placeholder for Clinton so that she can get in there, and then she would be the person. But I think Charlie Baker, if he was going to have a national role, I think it would have to be in a Democrat administration, and I think he would be most comfortable there. And I think that's what that's a pretty. I think it's an extremely plausible scenario, and I think even likely that he's going to, in some way, work to undermine Trump in 2020 in the presidential race somehow.
So, how does somebody like Elizabeth Warren have any credibility with people in Massachusetts? How does that even happen?
Yeah, well, she certainly stomped the Republican Jeff Deal. That was an embarrassing defeat for him, because I know Jeff, and we got along reasonably well. I didn't like his campaign manager at all, and he of course had played footsie with Baker in order to be able to stay in the good graces of the party. But he got stomped. I saw his campaign. He ran a hard race. He was everywhere, and all the speeches, and he did well in the debates and everything. But nevertheless, it's like it was 2-1 for Warren, and I think that that was the blue wave. The blue wave, I think, was a reality in the Democrat strongholds anyway. Maybe not enough to wipe out the Republicans where Republicans are stronger, but they spent billions of dollars to build that wave of momentum, which of course you have to do when you're out of power and your prospects look so bad. And that's what they did. And so Warren, the fix, in my opinion, the fix was always in for Baker, Warren, and Maura Healey, the lesbian attorney general, and that there was a deal in the elites of both parties that was what was going to be the result, and they achieved it through the normal, just the fact that the people who control information, the media, the corporate media, when the corporate media is all lined up in a particular direction, then they're going to get the result that they want, because that's who defines reality in the minds of most of the people in the public, because it doesn't control the genuinely conservative Republicans, and it probably doesn't control the genuinely far left progressives, the real, Bernie Sanders types. But the majority of voters, yes, it does control, and I think that's why we got the result that we saw in Massachusetts on November 4th.
Well, as someone who lives in Florida and has to live this stuff right now, had the result in Massachusetts not been what it was predetermined to be, do you think you would have had a Florida situation up there where, for example, almost 100,000 votes magically appear from a dumpster at a school in Miramar and the trunk of somebody's car and in a rented van that was part of a bomb threat?
Yeah, this is, this is the reason why the Democrat media always tries to make races appear closer than they are. They can't cheat when the numbers are really huge. There's only so much that you can do. But if the numbers are close, or if the public perceives that the numbers are close, then the amount of cheating that it takes to push the chosen side over the finish line is a little easier to achieve. If you've got a 10-point spread, you're not going to get accomplish that with cheating, as far as I know. Maybe they're better at it than I thought, but it's usually the case that they do pull these shenanigans like they're doing in Florida, only because it's razor thin, and then they pull out all the stops to bring in additional ballots from somewhere.
Right. Well, one last political question, and we talked about it a little bit before about how Massachusetts is throwing everything that it has at Trump, and Massachusetts isn't the only state doing that, and of course the entirety of, I guess we'll call it the swamp, since that's the popular term, the establishment, if you will, in D.C. has been throwing everything it has at Trump. The media has been throwing everything. And some days I question if Trump is really governing the country or if he's just privileged to live in the White House. And so that's the question I would ask you. Had you won the governorship of Massachusetts, do you think you could have effectively governed the state, or do you think you?
No, it would have been a Trump type scenario, except worse for me, because Trump at least had 2 years of having a Republican legislature, at least in name, to work with. But I would have had to deal with a supermajority of Democrats in both houses of the Massachusetts legislature. But I had a strategy. I was going to essentially declare and define the executive branch as a bastion of conservatism, and I would have used executive orders. And frankly, I believe that if I had won, it would have been such a crisis for the left that they would have done anything to get rid of me, so my answer would be even more dramatic than what President Trump has done. I would have intentionally gone forward to create a constitutional crisis on the pro-life issue. In fact, it was my plan that my very first action as governor would be to declare the personhood of the unborn with an executive order, and then task everyone under my authority in the executive branch to promote and defend that order all the way to the Supreme Court. And I would have found some pro-life state troopers to go down and shut down one or more of the abortion clinics to stop the killing. And I think at that point that would have been international news. It would have been Governor Lively against all the powers that be in Massachusetts, and with myself appealing to President Trump and the U.S. Supreme Court to rescue Massachusetts from the slaughter of the babies and essentially force the case into the Supreme Court, by the creation of a constitutional crisis. That was going to be my strategy, and I would either win or lose in a blaze of glory. And if I hadn't won, then everything would change, and probably in the whole country, because the conservatives would have just come out of the woodwork to follow the example. And if I lost, then they'd probably throw me in jail or something for. But that was my plan.
Well, you realize that once you get into legal doctrines like nullification, the 10th Amendment, and so forth, you're almost becoming an antebellum Southerner there.
Yeah, well, it's a revolution is necessary when you reach the level of totalitarian control that the left has in Massachusetts. When I talk the left, I'm talking about really what this all comes down to. This has always been, the culture war has always been a war between people who are coming from a Judeo-Christian biblical perspective. It's Judeo-Christian civilization, and I just deliberately span that. Torah-believing Jews and Bible-believing Christians who have essentially insisted that we are going to follow a creationist worldview, etc. That's Western civilization versus the Marxist worldview. When Karl Marx came forward standing upon Darwin's platform and declaring that humanity was evolving toward a perfect egalitarian society, and that we should just destroy the existing order so we can build this utopia on the ashes. That's always been the goal of Marxism. It's still the goal today, and that's what the battle has always been about. And the thing to understand, the simple, concise explanation that helps everybody to come to grips with this, is that secular humanism is the religion of Marxism, and political correctness is the moral code of secular humanism. Once you know that and you recognize it.
We are out of time for this week's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour, but we will have Scott back again in 2019. He will be our guest, and we will discuss his book, The Pink Swastika. And don't think that I'm just teasing you about that or leading you on about that. We've already recorded the interview, so it's good to go. We just need to get it produced, but it's already recorded, and we're gonna have it out there for you in 2019, unless Jesus comes back or a thermonuclear war erupts or something crazy apocalyptic happens. We're gonna do that for you. So look forward to having that Pink Swastika interview out there for you. It was some great stuff, but our hour is up here, so we're going to cut the interview right here. We got in all the conversation that Scott and I had about the politics, and then the next interview we'll talk about the book. Hope you'll take the time to go to Scott's website. It's on your screen if you're watching on YouTube. Otherwise, it's livelyforgovernor.us, livelyforgovernor.us. Some great material there. Of course, go to my website, www.dixieheritage.net, dixieheritage.net. And when you're there, you can sign up for our weekly newsletter, absolutely free of charge. And when you do, I will send you a free copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. You won't have to give me a credit card number or your phone number or any other intrusive information. All you have to do is give me your email address, and I will get that free book and that free newsletter out to you fairly quickly. Of course, next week, our broadcast will be going out on Friday, December 21st, just before Christmas. So we have a great Christmas special broadcast that we have prepared for you. So be sure to tune in next week. I know you're going to enjoy it. And of course, we have some great guests already lined up for 2019 as we get ready to go into our second year here on TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. And so I know you'll want to stay with us, not only through the rest of this year, but going into next year. So once again, from all of us here at TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for spending this hour with us again this week. And I look forward to seeing you again, or hearing you again, or you hearing me again, I guess I should say, next week. And until then, may your holiday preparations for the Christmas holiday, may they go well, and God bless.